Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This review covers the Wedell-Williams 121 Gilmore Red Line Air Racer. It's a Williams Brothers kit number 32521. It's in 1/32 scale kit and consists of about 75 pieces, molded in gray and one clear piece for the canopy. I'd call it a skill level 4 for the advanced builder. And you can buy these kits directly from the Williams Brothers site online. Now the engine is a radial unit, and a multi-piece construction helps add detail. The fuselage features recessed panel lines, and the kit comes with colorful water slide decals for 3 different versions. When you're done following the well illustrated instructions, it's about 8 3/4 inches long, 9 3/4 inches wide. It goes together pretty well, but the decals are a little problematic, and that's why I rate it for a higher skill level. Here's my version of the open box review. Now this kit has come in different boxings over the years, but it's essentially the same kit. And as you can see, it comes with some colorful decals, and I strongly suggest the use of setting solutions from the aftermarket to help them conform to contours on the model. But as you can see, I could pick up each sprue and talk about the parts, but I'd rather show you how to build the model. So if you'll follow along, we'll be doing that soon. Now always remember to follow the manufacturer's safety and use guidelines when using any of the products you see or hear mentioned in the review. Start construction by removing the engine components from the sprues and gathering those together along with the propeller. I used some liquid cement, which I'll be using for most of the construction, to glue the center and the rear of the engine halves together. I found that the push rod tubes that go on the front of the crankcase had a lot of flash, so I removed them and replaced them with some .06 brass tubing. So cut the pieces about the same length as the push rods in the kit, and there are 18 of them. And to get it the correct color, I used a product called blackening, and I just put that into a plastic cup and then the pieces, and it takes about 5 minutes. You stir them up every now and then to get them evenly covered, and then you just pour the blackening back into its container and dump the pieces out onto a paper towel. Now they're ready to apply to the engine. Now we can work on the cylinders, and we're going to paint those a flat black. So spray those and use clips to keep them off of any surface to contact them to make it a nice clean even finish. Now we'll work on the exhaust stacks, and they're pretty small parts. So what I did was use a little liquid cement, and I temporarily glued them to a piece of plastic so that I could paint them with some enamel silver. The actual prop is a polished aluminum, so to get that look I used some alclad chrome on it. First coat, of course, is a gloss black base coat, and after that dries, usually overnight, apply the alclad chrome in very light coats, followed by some testers flat black to the back side of the prop. To help with handling the motor during painting and assembly, I glued a piece of scrap plastic into the center hub there with some liquid cement on the back side, and I'll remove that later before I install the cowling to the engine. To weather the cylinders, I use a silver pencil, sandpaper, and a paintbrush. First, I rub the silver pencil on the sandpaper, and then gently rub the paintbrush in the fine leather dust that it creates. And this is then brushed onto the cylinders, giving it an appearance of being weathered. The cylinder on the left here is unweathered, and the one on the right is treated with the powder. I sprayed the crankcase then with some acrylic neutral gray, and after it had dried, I applied a watercolor wash of black and brown to simulate some oil stains on it. Using some liquid cement, I glued all 9 cylinders then to the crankcase. The inside of the cowl was unpainted, so it was a bare aluminum color. So I sprayed the inside of the cowl halves with some enamel chrome silver. You may find at this point in some test fitting as I did to fit the cowl halves that the top of the cylinders are too tall and they have to be sanded down a little so that the cowl fits tightly over the engine. Now the picture shows a gap in the cowl halves before I sanded them, and then the one on the right here will show you after I have sanded the tops with enough clearance to get the cowl halves to fit together. So later on, before I install the cowling, I'll touch up the cylinders on top with some flat black paint. With that modification, you can see that the cowl halves now fit properly around the engine. So to make them spark plug wires, I use some electrical wire. I pull out an individual strand, cut it to length, and then make the required bend. It's easy because it's copper. With your fingers, and then dab the end of the wire in some super glue and place the end on the spark plug. The push rod tubes then were installed to the engine with some super glue as well. Now I use some super glue to attach the exhaust stacks to the engine as well, and it is complete and ready for the cowl halves to be installed. I placed the cowl over the engine, and then I used a piece of Tamiya tape to apply over the seams to hold the halves together. I then used some liquid cement applied to the inside in order to make sure that it permeated the parting lines there and got some glue into them to assemble the cowl halves around the engine. Now note that the oil sump must be in line with the lower seam, so line those up when you glue the cowling on. After the glue has set, the seams of the cowl are then filled with some putty. Use your favorite brand and sand the seams with about a 400 to 500 grit sandpaper, and prime the cowl then with some Tamiya primer by taping off the engine and the inside to keep the paint out of there. Then set the engine and the cowl aside, and because they're ready to be installed onto the airframe after final coat. Locate and gather up the cockpit components and remove them from the sprue tree. I enhanced the cockpit floor somewhat because it seemed to be missing the control stick tube, so I replaced it with some 1/16 styrene and a little 3/32 brass tubing and attached the control stick to that. Now, like everyone else that builds models, I lost a part, and in this case I lost the control stick, so I made a new one from 1/16 styrene for the stick and 3/32 brass for the grip handle on top. The compass had a very large sink in the top of it, so I filled that with some putty and sanded it off smooth. So to paint the compass, because it was so small, I glued it to a piece of styrene, and then I painted it flat black and made some small white lines on the top. But you could maybe find, a decal from one of your kits to put in here. The roll cage structure on the Wedell-Williams racer was aluminum too, so to get that appearance I again used the Alclad paint. The first coat was gloss black base coat, and after that dries overnight you apply the second coats of chrome paint in thin layers. Now we're going to apply a wood tone finish to some of the parts. The floors, the rear bulkhead, and the grip handle on the control stick were made of wood. So I painted these using some Tester's enamel wood paint, and after the wood paint dried, I applied a light brushing of dark enamel brown to give it some texture. I also painted the roll cage tubes that are located on the rear of the bulkhead with some chrome paint to make them appear as if they were the aluminum roll cage parts, but you could also use some metal foil application here to provide that. Locate the instrument panel and then the decal that goes on that, and then soak the decal in some warm water for half a minute and apply it to the dash panel. Now paint the throttle quadrant enamel semi-gloss black, and then the knobs are painted red, black, and blue. The seat was aluminum, but it had a leather cover on the seating area, so I painted this using some enamel leather paint from Tester's. With all the paint dry, we can now assemble the cockpit by gluing them together with some liquid cement. Also remember that you need to remove the paint from any area that you want to glue to make sure it gets a good bond between the styrene pieces. I used some tape to hold it in place while it dried. To complete the assembly of the cockpit, I glued the compass to the cockpit floor rail there just in front of the stick in order to finish and complete the assembly here. I used some super glue for strength to keep that in position. Now the cockpit is ready to be installed into the airframe after the inside of the fuselage is painted first. We'll start working on the undercarriage components now, so go ahead and grab these pieces from the kit and stage them for work next. Please make note of the variations in the different versions that are available with the kit decals here. So the ones on the Gilmore Lion Red Lion 121, they're a little different than the number 92 plane. So I took those components for the Red Lion and glued the upper mount to the wheel pant. Glue the tire and wheel halves together using some liquid cement, and then kind of smooth off the seam, and I painted it with some Testors enamel rubber. I painted the hubs for the wheels with some aluminum, and after that dried, I placed the tires and wheels between the wheel pant halves, and then I applied some liquid cement to the wheel pants and set that aside to dry. After which, I used some putty to fill in the seams and the low spots on the wheel pants and sanded them to get them ready for paint and smoothing out those joints. Now the undercarriage is ready for final paint, and they'll be installed after that's complete. Next we'll work on the airframe itself, so remove these components from the sprue trees and get them ready to work with next. I modified the ailerons for the Gilmore Lion version of the kit by using a piece of tape there after I had glued the wings together and clamped them. So then I used the tape to find out exactly where I wanted to trim that trailing edge, and I used a sharp X-Acto blade and carefully scribed along the tape until the trailing edge of the aileron is removed. You can see the left photo here, you start your cuts, and in the right photo it's trimmed off flat. Working with the fuselage, you'll notice that it's got holes for rigging all the different configurations that are available from the kit decals. But I needed to plug this hole for mine, so I used a piece of 3/32 diameter styrene and some liquid cement and glued it into place, and then after it dried I sanded it smooth on the fuselage, both on the inside and the outside. Inside of the fuselage is bare aluminum too, so to get that look I used the Alclad paints and sprayed the gloss black base coat on the inside, and after it had dried overnight I applied some of the Alclad chrome and very light coats. And part of the cockpit is enclosed with fabric, so to accomplish this I applied a coat of Testors flat white inside at that location. Here you can see the aluminum is above the roll cage rail there, and after the flat white paint had dried I installed the cockpit using some liquid cement and super glue in the smaller areas of contact for strength. So it was used to hold it into place while the liquid cement dried into all the fissures and glue points. I used a small piece of brass tubing to replicate the pivot tube and glued it into the leading edge of the left wing. Carefully align the halves of the fuselage together, and then I used some liquid cement and held it together with some small clamps and let it dry overnight for a good solid joint. After the fuselage halves had dried overnight, I removed the clamps and applied some putty to the seams there. And I used some Tamiya tape to keep the putty where I wanted it and minimized sanding on the rest of the fuselage. Now we can glue the wings onto the fuselage using some liquid cement, and be careful to align it and make sure that they are equal on each side of the fuselage and level, so that you get a good proper finish. You may find an issue here with the landing gear pockets on the bottom of the fuselage. They're in different locations depending on which version you're making. Now the Red Lion's landing gear were on the inboard edge of this pocket, and there's some small rectangular pieces that are supplied to glue in to fill the void, but unfortunately they weren't quite big enough to fill the gap. I decided to start preparing the canopy next while I would be working on the rest of the fuselage. So I always dip those parts into some future floor polish, which is now called Pledge floor polish, but it's a liquid wax for floors that makes any window glass look clearer and crisper. So just dip it in there, wick off the excess and let it dry, and after about 5 minutes it's pretty much done. But give it a little time, make sure that it's absolutely dry before you handle it anymore. We'll assemble the horizontal stabilizers using some liquid cement, and there's two positions that they can be attached into, and the Gilmore's Red Lion stabilizers were placed in front of the slots on the rear section there. Now we can return to those landing gear pockets and seams, and we're going to sand those down after applying some putty to them with some 400 wet and dry sandpaper, and level those out where the wings and the landing gear meet, and apply some more putty wherever needed to get yourself nice smooth joints. Fortunately, the canopy frame isn't too hard to do. Masking it is fairly simple with this one. But after the future has dried, and you might want to give it overnight because you don't want to put fingerprints in your canopy now. I use some Tamiya tape and a sharp razor blade and a toothpick, so I start by putting the tape onto the canopy along one of the panel lines, and in this case I use the center one, and then let the rest overlap for now. I then use a toothpick, a round one, to burnish the tape to the canopy, and then with a sharp razor blade I cut the tape along the panel line and then reburnish it to get the edge down good. Now you continue this until the entire canopy is covered and the frame is exposed. Now to install the canopy, I used a little tape loop there, you can see it at the top, to handle it, and I applied some of the crystal clear product to the bottom edge of the canopy and the back edge there, and put it into position using the tape loop handle. Now we'll start working on painting, and I used a piece of wood dowel that fit into the engine mount hold to hold the aircraft while painting it. Then I applied a coat of a medium gray primer, and this will show you how the seams appear and whether or not they need any attention. So you may need to go back over and add some putty to the seams and smooth it out, and then reapply your primer. But since the wings were removable, I had left them removable to transport the aircraft just as it was for the races back in the 30s. The wings would actually come off, and so I didn't fill those seams along the wing route. So after I had finished addressing the seams that needed some extra work, I gave it a good sanding with 800 then 1200 sandpaper, and rinsed it off lightly and applied another coat of primer. The color for the Gilmore was a cream color, so I had to custom mix the paint, and I used some acrylic paints with 95% flat white and about 4% insignia yellow and 1% brown. Start with some light coats, some tack coats, and then finally progress to heavier coats to get a nice even coating. Paint the entire airframe, the landing gear, and the cowl with the cream color mixture. Now comes probably one of the trickier parts of the build, and that's painting the crazy paint scheme that looks so nice on the Wedell-Williams racer. The wings, the stabilizers, and the vertical fin had red outlines, pretty heavy. So what I did was I used some fine line and bendable tape, and I went around those edges with that. And then the rest of the airframe was covered with some blue masking tape. And I trimmed as close as I could to the outline of the original tape around the edges, the masking tape for the blue painter's tape there. And then I removed the edging tape and then sprayed all the untaped areas an acrylic insignia red to color the edges and the wheel pants. As you can imagine, after removing the tape, there were some areas that needed to be touched up. So using a combination of a hobby blade to scrape off any of the red that was too heavy or too thick in an area, and some extra cream paint from the mix, and some extra insignia red, I cleaned up all the rough areas and smoothed out all of the ridges to give it a nice look overall. Once I had gotten all the cleanup work done and allowed it to dry thoroughly, I applied a coat of the floor polish to the entire airframe, the undercarriage, and the cowl to give it a gloss coat. Now it's time to apply the decals, and they're very colorful, and there's some large decals here, so I would use some setting solution for the larger ones. So put those into place, use plenty of warm water, and use some warm water also on the model to position them, and then some setting solutions to make sure they conform to all the contours. Use the location guide and the box art to see where they go, and go ahead and apply all the decals. Then smooth them out, of course, get out any trapped air or water bubbles, and let those dry overnight. And then the decals on the cowl, however, did not fit at the front, so there was a gap there, and it's the first real issue that I came across is that these decals weren't quite big enough. So we'll have to touch that up by mixing some paint again. I used some acrylic insignia red and flat black, mostly the red, and then slowly added the black until I got a good match with the cowl's red colored decals to touch those up. So my results weren't too bad. They weren't perfect, but they actually looked pretty good. I guess you could spend as much time as you want to try and get them just exactly right. To seal the decals into place, I once again, after everything had dried, gave it all a coat of the floor polish to make sure that they all stayed in place and look more like painted on than stuck on decals. Using some super glue for strength, I glued the landing gear into place to make sure they were good and strong. Of course, the wing walks always present a special issue. They're flat, and in this case I had to mask off the entire airframe except for the wing walk area, and then I sprayed those with some acrylic flat black. After about 20 minutes, I removed the masking tape and masking paper, and the wing walks were then complete, and they looked good from being sprayed on as opposed to being painted on by brush. I painted the pivot tube with some enamel chrome silver to give it that aluminum appearance. Now's the time to glue the engine and the cowl on with some super glue for strength. Make sure it's aligned, and of course you've got the guides there along with the decals that will help you put that into proper position. Now the unveiling comes when you remove the tape from the canopy and see how your canopy frame turned out. There are some margins of availability for repair, but by and large you can't do too much because you'll scrape the glass if you try and use a blade. So pretty much how it comes out is how it comes out. You can do some repair with finish paint though, and try and make that look better if you need to. For final construction of the main frame, we're going to add the prop into place on the engine shaft now. Next is the application of the rigging, and I used some of the smallest music wire that I had. And what you do is you start a small bend at one end and then size it up for length, and then cut it off about an 1/8 inch longer. And then of course you bend the other end just at the angle where it goes into the holes, either on the fuselage, the wing pants, or the wing. And then just use a dot of superglue to install the wires into place. Well, there you have it. Now there will be a couple of extra pieces for different variations left over, and the decals of course for the different versions. But this stunning example of the golden era of air racers is now complete, and if you take your time and you're patient, you can be really proud to put this one together. And if I were you, I'd go to the Williams Brothers site, buy one, and put it on my shelf. We hope you liked this premium step-by-step model kit review, and so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find us on Facebook and at our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks!